Okay, hello everyone. We are going to do the presentation again. For those of you who are with us today, I am doing this over because I want to simplify the presentation that I did for you today. I realize I threw a lot of information at you, and I want to simplify a little bit what I told you today so that it does not feel so overwhelming. So if you were in the presentation today, this may seem a little easier to swallow. If you weren't in the presentation today, well, you just lucked out because I'm going to give you the quick and dirty tips for how to edit yourself, a guide to self-editing. Are you ready? Here we go. First of all, I want to begin by starting you on the editing roadmap. So first, as I said earlier today, we need to understand our expectations, know your resources, you need to prepare, follow through, and then of course we will talk about proofreading and editing. So, of course, this still stands. The key to any good paper is understanding what is expected of you, understanding key factors such as your audience, the purpose of the paper, and your teacher's expectations. It will give you a standard and goal to attain as you edit. Tips to meet expectations: review collegiate level writing samples to understand format and tone. That still stands. If you are able to get your hands on examples of things that others have done before you, it gives you a model to follow. Of course, review your teacher's syllabus to understand what the teacher's expectations are. Review assignment details to understand specific assignment instructions, and definitely ask the teacher for guidance. Don't be afraid to ask questions. He or she is the one who can tell you what he or she expects you to do. Always do that. Also, I want to put in a plug for the Writing Center. We are a resource for you, and I encourage you to not wait until the last minute to come to us and ask for help. Don't wait until the last day or the day before a paper is due to get our help with the writing assignment. We do our best work ahead of time. I cannot stress that enough. Also, there are other resources, including writing resources, that you should be aware of. The Purdue OWL is an excellent resource. English professors and the Writing Center rely on the Purdue OWL, so you need to bookmark that website for yourself as well. The A&M University Library databases are also an excellent resource, but also there are LibGuides available on the library website that you should be aware of. LibGuides are resources that the librarians put together for particular disciplines, and they are quick guides that will help you to find information that is available specific to your field, and you should be aware of those as well. Of course, the Writing Center has its own website, and it is available right off of the A&M University main page. You can just go on the main page and put in the search bar Writing Center, and it'll come right up. And then there's a site that is also very useful. We use it as well. It's called Grammar Girl Quick and Dirty Tips, and you can access it as well as Grammarly.com. You as an A&M University student actually have access to the pro version of Grammarly. You don't have to use the free version, but you do need to go to the University Library web page, the main page. If you scroll down, there is a code there that you can use to access the pro version or the premium version of Grammarly. So take advantage of that as well. And then if all else fails, when you're not sure about formatting and structure for a particular type of writing assignment, we do Google from time to time, and it is okay to Google templates and examples of writing, different types of writing, to see how those things should be put together. So preparation is key. We've talked in earlier workshops about preparing and following the writing process, and a lot of that is planning. Planning is very important, and you can check out some of our earlier workshops where we talk about giving yourself time to write, doing an outline, drafting a thesis, and finding sources. So certainly putting those things in place will be very important. Also, it's very important to remember that when you're doing the writing process and when you're doing the editing of your writing, you want to think from big, you want to work from big to small. You don't want to do the little nitty-gritty, tiny editing tasks before you've worked out some of the bigger issues. So think globally first and then work your way down to those smaller local issues. When we talk about global things, we're talking about the big ideas, the main points that you're making in your paper. And then when we talk about local things, we're talking about at the paragraph level in terms of organizing those sub points that are supporting the main points. And then you can work your way down to those grammar and punctuation things that are going on. Now, I've narrowed down the quick fixes. In the earlier presentation, I had 10 things on the list. I've narrowed them down to just 3. Did I say 3? No. I've narrowed it down to 5. Okay, here they are. First of all, if you want to improve as a writer and if you want to be able to edit your writing, I still say you need to be a reader. You need to read more. Now, you may not love reading, but if you can just read a little more than you do now, that will help because you want to become acquainted with the standard usage of the language that you speak. And the more acquainted you are with standard usage, the easier it will be for you to identify the problems in your own writing. Then you want to become just more intentional and aware of your own usage and the errors that you tend to make most frequently. If you pay attention to the types of errors you make frequently, then you can more easily learn how to correct them. How do you pay attention? Well, first of all, if your professor is always sending things back with commas, with circles around the comma errors, you know that commas are your thing. So you figure out the rules for commas and how to fix them, and you pay attention to the places where you tend to trip up over commas. You don't have to learn all the rules of grammar. You just learn the rules for the things that you struggle with. And then when you're editing your work, it helps if you read your paper out loud. It's easy to fix the errors that you make when you read your paper silently to yourself. But when you hear it read out loud, or if you even have someone else read it to you, it's a lot easier to hear where something is amiss. And then keep in mind that you're writing for others. A lot of times we assume that the meaning is clear because we know what we mean. But remember that you're writing for someone who is not you. So make sure that you think about what is it that your audience needs to know in order to understand what it is that you're trying to say. A lot of times that will help you to know what else is needed. So let's get down to the proofing and editing part of this presentation. First and foremost, it really comes down to our understanding of what a sentence is. Yes, it is as basic as that. What is a sentence? Now, usually when I ask that question, people say, oh, a sentence has a subject and a verb. Yes, that is true, but that's not all. A sentence is an independent clause with a subject and a verb, yes. But the part that we often forget is that it also must form a complete thought. And the tip is, when we are editing our work, you need to ask yourself who or what is doing the action. Because there are clauses that can have a subject and a verb, but if it doesn't form a complete thought, that's where we can get into trouble. So if we begin with that sort of concept in mind, then we can move from there in determining where the trouble is in our writing as we do the work of editing. So let's take a closer look. Here are the 3 steps to identifying errors in our writing. Step 1. Isolate everything that isn't the subject or the verb. Okay, so in the earlier presentation, I got all in the weeds with the prepositional phrases and the modifying phrases and the gerund phrases. We won't get into that today. I think I will separate those into another presentation and we'll dig into what exactly each of those is. I will also put links in the comments or in the description rather, so that you can dig into what a prepositional phrase is and what a dependent clause is. But let me just say this. A prepositional phrase begins with a preposition, and dependent clauses begin with these words such as if, when, and since. And a gerund phrase begins with that verb that has the ing ending. And the bottom line is any one of these phrases acts as a modifier for something in the sentence. The point is they signal information that adds to the sentence, adds in some way to either the subject or the verb, but it is not the subject or the verb. So once you see these prepositional phrases or modifying phrases, the dependent clause or the gerund phrase, you know that you need to pull those out. And once you do, you can identify the subject and the verb. And that leads us to step 2. Once you're able to identify the subject and the verb, you can ask yourself the question, who or what is doing the action? Or is it a state of being? Because there's also those to be verbs, which we know as well. And then the question is, do they agree? If they don't, you probably will easily be able to fix it. So let's look at this example. The boy with the heavy books either look or looks like your brother. Well, we have a phrase there. In this case, it's a prepositional phrase, with the heavy books. If we isolate that phrase, as step 1 has told us to do, we kind of drop that out. We pull that out in order to identify the subject and verb of this sentence. Now we know that the subject has to be the boy because we've pulled out the heavy books with the heavy books. We know it can't be anything in that phrase because that's our prepositional phrase. And so who or what is doing the action? Well, the boy, and the verb is look or looks. Now we can determine which form of the verb works with the boy, that is singular. So the boy looks makes much more sense than the boy look. And because we took with the heavy books out, we're not confused, as we perhaps might be if we left it there. We might be tempted to use the other form of the verb. And so it helps us to easily see which one is correct. Step 3. Now, identifying the subordinate clauses with those dependent clause markers that we mentioned can also help to eliminate sentence fragments and run-ons. As we said before, knowing that a sentence has a subject and a verb and forms a complete thought also lets us know that if a dependent clause is present, it has to form a complete thought, which means it's not enough for it to just have a subject and a verb. So, this example is a perfect one to show us how that might work. In this case, we have if we're going out of town. Because that little word if is there, we know that it would be incomplete if we didn't have the second half of that sentence there. We need to pack. Even though we're going out of town has the subject and the verb present. The signifier if signals to us that the rest of that portion of the sentence has to be there as well. So, if we want to combine sentences, we have to also be careful because we can run into problems with those commas if we do that incorrectly. So when you have that issue with commas, as many of us do, here are the ways that we can fix those. There's only 3 ways that we can combine a complete sentence with another complete sentence. Only can we combine them if we separate them with an end punctuation. I have a period here, but we can also use a question mark or an exclamation point. Just depends on what it is that we're saying, of course. Or we can use a semicolon. Sometimes we get very confused with that punctuation mark, but this is the only time that we would use it if we're combining a complete sentence with another complete sentence. That is the only time that a semicolon is used. I take that back. The only other time is if we're separating items in a series that also have commas in them. So I apologize. I almost said, made a statement that was completely incorrect, but very rarely would there be another time to use a semicolon. And then we can also combine two complete sentences with a comma, but only if it is combined with the coordinating conjunction. And so you want to be very careful that you don't have that comma joining two sentences without that very special word, which we're going to look at in just a moment. But let's talk about how we make the decision to combine two sentences, and how, because it does matter which one we choose. It's not random. You would use a period to join two complete sentences if the meaning of the sentences that you're joining are disconnected enough that there's no need to combine them any other way. So a period signals a full stop, which means what will follow the period is the next idea. You're moving on to the next point. Here's an example. There's not a need necessarily to join these two ideas, so a period is used. A semicolon, however, indicates a stop also, but the two ideas are more closely connected, or the intended meaning is meant to be that these two ideas are closely connected. So really, it's a matter of you, the writer, signaling to your reader that I want you to see these two things as in some way or another connected. With the coordinating conjunctions, you are given more options for the relationship that you want to show between the ideas expressed in the two sentences that you're joining. Here you can see, depending on which of the conjunctions you use, the meaning changes. If you use but, you're showing opposition. If you use and, you're adding to the information in the first sentence. If you use so, you're indicating that the second half of the sentence is causation. And so the choice is yours, really, as the writer. Sometimes when we think of grammar, we assume it's mechanical, it's disconnected from meaning, but that is absolutely not true. The choice you make in something as simple as punctuation makes all the difference in meaning. So, if you're going to combine sentences, your overall meaning and purpose will determine whether you use end punctuation, whether you use a semicolon, or whether you use a comma with a coordinating conjunction. How do you remember which of the coordinating conjunctions are acceptable with a comma to join two sentences? You use the acronym that you learned perhaps in grade school. It's FANBOYS, and that stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Now it's time to practice. Let's see how well you do. First, let's look at subject-verb agreement. The sentence reads, "The greatest invention in the world be the computer." Not many people realizes that the first computer were actually invented by Charles Babbage in the 19th century. At first, computers was only used to calculate complicated math problems. Although the first computers was massive, sometimes filling whole buildings, they is really only useful now because they has gotten smaller. Do you hear the problems with subject-verb agreement? How would you fix it? Maybe you could pause the video and try to fix it before we move on. Here's the corrected version. The greatest invention in the world is the computer. Not many people realize that the first computer was actually invented by Charles Babbage in the 19th century. At first, computers were only used to calculate complicated math problems. Although the first computers were massive, sometimes filling whole buildings, they are really only useful now because they have gotten smaller. Here's an example of dangling modifiers. When I went to the beach last Saturday, I borrowed an old bathing suit from a friend. Because I had forgotten to bring my own bathing suit while the waist on borrowed suit would have been tight on a doll. Waiting for me to come out, there was a slight altercation. After some rude boys came and began to make insulting remarks. Do you hear the problems there? I think there's some dangling modifiers. Pause the video and see if you can fix them. Here's a hint. When there's a dangling modifier, you have a phrase that is pointing to someone or something that is not named in the sentence. So here's the correction. When I went to the beach last Saturday, I borrowed an old bathing suit from a friend because I had forgotten to bring my own bathing suit. The waist on my borrowed suit would have been tight on a doll. While my friends were waiting for me to come out, there was a slight altercation. Some rude boys came over and began to make insulting remarks. Here's an example of a gerund verb phrase. After having danced all night, it was late and no restaurants were open. What's the problem here? Well, after having danced all night is a phrase that doesn't have anything to modify. So how do we fix it? After having danced all night, Mary was exhausted. It was late and no restaurants were open, so she decided to go home and make a sandwich. What about the next one? Again, there's no subject named. Walking down the street, the sky was a brilliant blue. There also should be a subject closely connected to the modifying phrase. Here's the correction. Walking down the street, John noticed that the sky was a brilliant blue. What about this run-on sentence? Tanya studied so hard for her test that she didn't get to sleep at all the night before the test and was exhausted. When she showed up to actually take the test, she fell asleep at her desk and dreamed she got an A. There's a lot of subjects and verbs and lots of complete thoughts, but we want to limit the number of subjects and verbs in any one sentence. So let's break it up. Tanya studied so hard for her test that she didn't get to sleep at all the night before, period. She was exhausted when she showed up to actually take the test, period. She fell asleep at her desk, and she dreamed she got an A. Notice the choice that the writer makes to connect the two ideas in the last sentence, but to break up the ideas in the earlier sentences. There's more than one way to express similar ideas, but the important thing is to make it clear and complete. Last one. The three dogs do not always get along. One of them has no concept of personal space, another is very protective about his food, and the third is always demanding all the attention of their owner. She is really clingy, that's why. A lot going on there. Here's the correction. The three dogs do not always get along. One of them has no concept of personal space. Another is very protective about his food. And the third is always demanding all the attention of its owner because she is really clingy. I would be interested in knowing if you have other ways that you might correct these sentences that might also be correct. I'd be happy for you to email your possibilities to me at write.place@aamu.edu. You can always make an appointment with me if you have further questions. We are always here to help. And I hope that this workshop gave you at least a little insight into how you can edit yourself. I wish you the best of luck.